$5,500. That was the number that kept flashing in my head like a broken neon sign. The amount Maple Ridge Community Association, the mighty MRCA, decided to charge me, not for something I'd done, but for the mountain of snow they had been dumping on my land for 3 straight weeks, a punishment bill for their own mess, taped to my windshield at the exact moment my family was barely staying above water. It started one brutal winter morning at 6:47 a.m., when the metal scream of plow blades on asphalt ripped me out of sleep, diesel engines rumbling outside like tanks rolling through suburbia, and I dragged myself to the window expecting normal clearing work. Instead, I watched 4 association trucks crawl up the main road of Maple Ridge Crossing, lift their beds, and pour every pound of snow from the neighborhood onto the strip of land that technically belonged to me, right where their private street met the public road, a wall of filthy ice and salt and gravel slamming across my driveway, so tall I couldn't even see my own grass anymore. My name is Liam Carter. I'm a former combat engineer who now runs heavy equipment for a living. 20-plus years of pushing earth and concrete around. And when all this happened, my wife Megan had just finished another round of chemo. She was exhausted and pale, but still trying to smile in front of our 16-year-old twins, Olivia and Chloe, who were juggling SAT stress and teenage drama on top of quietly wondering if they were going to lose their mom. We'd sold our bigger home to pay medical bills, and the small corner house I'd inherited from Uncle Hank in Summit Ridge, Colorado, was supposed to be our reset button, the place where we could finally breathe again instead of choosing every week between groceries and copays. Uncle Hank's lot sits right at the junction where the public road meets the little private street the HOA loves to brag about. And here's the twist. Nobody outside the plat maps understood. The first 40-something feet of that private road actually cut across my deeded property. No easement recorded, no formal right-of-way, just a handshake deal from the late 80s where my uncle, being the kind of man who lent his tools to anyone, said sure, go ahead and use it, and never made them write anything down, which worked fine until people who love power more than paperwork realized free access is a very profitable habit. By the time that first week of snow was done, the air outside smelled like brine and exhaust. My boots crunched on frozen chunks the size of bowling balls, and when I stepped out to confront the lead driver, he shrugged at me like I was the unreasonable one. Where else we supposed to put it? He said, and in that moment I understood this wasn't one bad call from a lazy crew. This was routine. It saved MRCA tens of thousands a year in proper removal, and they were banking on the dead guy's nephew being as quiet as the dead guy. The thing they didn't know was that I named my machines after generals, and my main dozer, Old Storm, has moved more dirt than most people have seen in their lifetime, and the man running Old Storm had spent 3 tours watching powerful people treat regular folks like disposable pieces on a map. So when I stood there in that bitter air, breath fogging, watching their trucks finish dumping half the subdivision onto my lawn, something in me shifted from shock to calculation, because these people had just handed me a leverage problem. And leverage is something I understand very, very well. The fine notice showed up 3 days later, tucked under my wiper like a parking ticket from the universe, official MRCA letterhead, pretty logo, and a line that said I owed $500 for snow accumulation creating safety hazards, plus a little diagram explaining proper snow management, as if I'd never seen winter before. And as I read it twice at the kitchen table, the paper crackling in my fist, Megan looked up from a stack of hospital bills and asked what was wrong, and it took everything in me not to slam the letter down and scream, because they weren't just using my yard as a dump site, they were charging us for the privilege. I drove straight to the biggest house on Maple Ridge Crossing, the one with the perfect hedges and the white luxury SUV parked on a circular driveway. And when Veronica Langford, president of MRCA, 62 years old with inherited money, pearls for taking out trash, and a license plate that literally read Queen, opened the door, she looked at me like I was trying to sell her cheap cable, not like a homeowner she'd just slapped with a fine for her own snow. And when I showed her the notice and asked her to explain, she slid into this smooth, practiced tone that only comes from years of getting her way, telling me the association had prescriptive rights to that strip of land, that we've used it for 37 years, your uncle understood the arrangement, and that snow dumping counted as reasonable maintenance. I might run bulldozers. But I'm not stupid. I know enough law to understand that prescriptive rights is just a fancy phrase for we've been doing this so long we hope nobody checks the rules. And I also know that for a prescriptive easement to exist, the use has to be hostile, without permission, and if my uncle had ever written even once that he allowed them to cross, that clock resets to zero over and over. So when she refused to show me any recorded easement, told me that documentation was internal board material, and sent out a mass email about a dangerous new resident threatening emergency access, I realized two things at the same time. One, the MRCA had been charging my neighbors hundreds a year for road maintenance on land they didn't own, and two, Veronica had absolutely no idea that the quiet guy she was trying to bully had spent his life learning how to use weight, pressure, and timing to move mountains. Neighbors started knocking after that email, not to complain about me, but to ask questions. Jim Holloway from 2 doors down held up the fine notice on his own snow-dumped yard and asked if it was true the association didn't actually own the strip of road. Janet Lowe across the way wondered out loud why they'd been paying $200 a year for road maintenance if the road wasn't even theirs, and as I stood there in my driveway with snow squeaking under my boots and diesel stink still lingering in the air, the anger I'd been nursing began to crystallize into something sharper: opportunity. That weekend I did something extremely petty and extremely deliberate. I took a shovel and every spare hour I had, and I moved their snow back piece by piece, not onto Veronica's lawn, not into some innocent neighbor's yard, but right back across that little private street, spread evenly like frosting, turning their emergency access route into a slick mess they couldn't ignore. And sure enough, at 6 in the morning on Monday, my doorbell rang like a fire alarm. Veronica standing there with 2 board members behind her like backup singers, announcing a new $5,000 fine for vandalism and destruction of common areas, saying, "Our street," like the asphalt had come out of her trust fund. I asked one question: by whose permission has your street been crossing my land for 30+ years? And when she stuttered, then promised they'd conduct a survey to establish boundaries, I smiled and told her I'd hire my own, because if there's one thing the military teaches you, it's to never rely on the other side's map. 3 days later, Dale Morton from Morton Land Surveying, a guy whose reputation in Summit County is about as solid as granite, showed up with crews and equipment that looked like NASA had downsized to snow country, lasers sweeping, metal detectors pinging, bright paint marking lines in the white. And when he handed me the finished survey, it read like a death certificate for MRCA's claim. That cute little private street was intruding exactly 42 feet into my property. No easement, no deed restriction, nothing but years of habit disguising decades of trespass. I ran copies of that survey at the print shop, stapled them to a simple note, and slid one under every door in Maple Ridge Crossing, not to flex, but because people deserve truth when someone's been collecting their money under false pretenses. And that's when the simmering unease in the neighborhood boiled over into real anger. Phone calls all night, messages asking if the document was legit, me pointing them right to the county website where they could pull the same map for $15 in 20 minutes. Veronica responded the only way people like her know how, with an emergency board meeting full of accusations about misinformation and hostile residents. And when I walked into the tiny community room, it was jammed with more than 100 people crammed into space built for half that. Stale coffee and nervous sweat hanging in the air, everyone waiting to hear whether their board had been lying to them for years, or whether I really was the villain of her emails. She opened with a speech about tradition and established usage and threats to community safety, and when she finally took a breath, I stood and calmly asked to see the recorded easement or deed showing MRCA's rights to my land. She tried the proprietary line again, and I reminded her there is no such thing as a secret easement, that property rights filed with the county are public by definition. And when she blurted, in front of 60 witnesses, that the board doesn't have to justify established rights to owners who refuse to be good neighbors, you could feel the floor tilt. Because she basically admitted they had nothing but arrogance and time. Not long after that, a thick envelope landed in my mailbox, heavy paper and a letterhead from Langford, Shaw, and Pierce LLP. The kind of downtown law firm that charges more per hour than I used to make in a week, ordering me to cease and desist property interference, dropping terms like adverse possession and prescriptive easement. And tucked neatly in the third paragraph was the real confession. Formal documentation may not have been recorded, which is lawyer language for we're bluffing and praying. You don't call it. I did what Uncle Hank would have done if cancer and time hadn't taken him first. I called Gordon Hale, the estate attorney who had handled my uncle's paperwork, a man who has spent 40 years cleaning up HOA messes in Colorado. And when he read the letter, he actually chuckled, explained that adverse possession requires hostile use, that if we could prove my uncle had given permission, even once, the legal clock never started, and told me that if I had the stomach for a fight, we could turn their entire strategy into a boomerang. That's how I ended up at the county recorder's office over the holidays, meeting Linda Chavez, a deputy who had helped me dig up plat maps before and now agreed to spend an hour combing through dusty boxes from the late 80s, pages yellowed and stapled badly, until she pulled out a neatly pinned letter from Uncle Hank to the very first board, dated January 1988, where he wrote, in his slow carpenter's handwriting, that they could use the strip of my land for access for now, as a favor, until the county figures something out, which meant every year after that was permissive use, not hostile. And every argument about adverse possession had just turned to slush. Then Linda found tax records showing my uncle had told the assessor, year after year, that he was allowing the association to cross his property and should get a small break for it. And right beside that, she found that MRCA had been claiming tax deductions for maintaining a road they didn't own, tens of thousands written off as expenses on land that wasn't theirs, a paper trail that smelled a lot like fraud to anyone who's ever seen a balance sheet. I went home with copies of everything, spread them across the kitchen table like a war map, and as Megan poured coffee and the twins giggled in the other room over their Christmas gifts, we sketched out something that was part engineering project, part protest art, and part legal line in the snow, a 12-foot-high, 30-foot-wide wall built entirely from the snow they'd dumped on me, reinforced with rebar, positioned exactly along the property line where their private street tried to sneak onto my land, something they couldn't drive around, couldn't ignore, and absolutely couldn't touch without committing crimes on camera. I called my union buddy Miguel Torres, who runs the local operators chapter, told him what Veronica had been doing, how she tried to bury me in fines and letters, and he laughed this deep, delighted laugh and said, "You want bodies and iron, brother, you got them." And within a day, I had a list of operators, compactors, and trucks loaned by guys who were tired of their own HOAs pushing them around. Men who understood that sometimes the right job, in the right place, at the right moment, sends a message heavier than concrete. The morning we started building, the sky over Summit Ridge was a hard, cold blue, my breath hanging in front of me as Old Storm rumbled to life, diesel fumes mixing with that sharp metallic smell of frozen air, and by 6 a.m. the crew Miguel had promised were lined up in my driveway, coffee in gloved hands, grinning like kids about to pull the world's most legal prank, while a van from Channel 9 rolled up, and Kaylin Gwynn, an investigative reporter with a taste for HOA scandals, hopped out with her camera guy and asked if I was ready to make some people very uncomfortable on the evening news. We double-checked the survey with Dale. Every stake and paint mark triple confirmed. Gordon had combed through the bylaws and confirmed I didn't need a single permit to move snow on my own property. Linda had already quietly tipped Detective Sean O'Rourke in the county fraud unit about the tax deductions and bogus maintenance fees, and Deputy Harris, who'd been out once already when Veronica tried to claim my survey stakes were dangerous, had told me, off the record, that as long as I stayed inside the line, any attempt to tear down that wall would be a very interesting report. At 8 on the dot, I dropped the blade of Old Storm into the first mound of snow they'd dumped on us, the crunch and slide of ice under steel sounding, to me, like justice finally moving, and we started feeding that snow to the compactor, layer by layer, packing it tight, driving rebar down every couple of feet until the base of the wall was solid enough you could park a truck on it. Kayla narrating into her mic about a veteran turning HOA abuse into a very visible property improvement. Neighbors drifting out in boots and hats, clutching mugs, eyes wide as they realized I wasn't bluffing, that the corner lot they'd always treated as a convenient afterthought was, in fact, a choke point. By the time the wall reached 8 feet, people were lined up along the edge of the MRCA street, some nervous, some openly thrilled, whispering things like, "Can he really do that?" And, "I've been waiting 16 years for someone to stand up to her." And right on cue, the white SUV appeared, Veronica behind the wheel. Her face a carefully curated mask that cracked the second she saw 30 feet of compacted snow and steel rising like a fortress along a line she'd always assumed was hers. She pulled up, slammed the door, marched to the property line with her attorney from Langford, Shaw and Pierce, Elliot Lang, trailing behind, and started shouting for the cameras that I was holding the neighborhood hostage, that I was endangering families. And I let her talk until she ran out of breath before explaining, calmly, that I was building a temporary winter structure entirely on my land, that I had a survey, a deed, and county records to prove it, and that any obstruction she was experiencing was just the natural consequence of no longer being allowed to trespass for free. Kayla's camera kept rolling as Elliot tried to pull the conversation into legalese, talking about ongoing claims and established access, and the crowd started murmuring when I asked, loudly, for the recorded easement again, and he couldn't produce anything but hand-waving. And then Veronica, furious and cornered, did the one thing every bully eventually does. She stepped over the line. She stomped onto my side of the stakes, grabbed one of Dale's survey markers, yanked it out of the ground, and threw it at my boots, yelling about people like you not respecting how we do things here, and the phrase, "people like you," hung in the air like smoke, with every person present hearing exactly what she meant. And when Deputy Harris's cruiser rolled up at that exact moment, summoned by a noise complaint but arriving to a front row seat at her meltdown, he watched the footage on Kayla's camera, glanced at the survey I handed him, and very quietly informed Veronica she was under arrest for trespassing and destroying private property. Her arrest wasn't cinematic in a Hollywood way, no dramatic zoom or swelling music, just a 60-something woman in pearls, realizing, too late, that the rules she'd been waving at everyone else actually applied to her too, her wrists in cuffs, her shouts about property values and ungrateful newcomers fading as Harris read her rights and guided her into the back of the car. And the only soundtrack was the low murmur of 100 neighbors finally seeing the power imbalance flipped on its head. The wall stayed right where it was, tall and white and impossible to ignore, and a few hours later the remaining MRCA board members, now very aware that their president was sitting in a holding cell while Detective O'Rourke dug through their books, showed up at my house with Elliot and a court-appointed mediator named Patricia Ward, because the community center, as Kayla gleefully pointed out on camera, was on the wrong side of my snow fortress. We sat around my kitchen table, Megan pouring coffee like it was any other afternoon, while Patricia laid out the only deal that made sense. The association would formally admit there was no easement, pay a lump sum to compensate for years of illegal dumping and trespass, sign a recorded access agreement with a monthly fee for crossing my land, refund the surprise legal defense assessments they'd slapped on everyone to pay for Veronica's war, and terminate her contract with Langford Estates Management, the shell company she'd been using to double bill them for road work. I told them I agreed on one condition, that the back payment, every dollar of it, go straight to Summit County Veterans Outreach for PTSD counseling and housing help, because I didn't need hush money. I needed my daughters to see that when you push back on injustice, you don't do it just for yourself, you do it to make the whole system a little less rotten. The wall stayed up until spring, a frozen monument to the day Maple Ridge Crossing remembered what property lines actually mean, and when it finally melted, the grass under it came in greener than anywhere else, insulated all winter by the very problem they had tried to dump on us. While Veronica quietly disappeared from the neighborhood gossip, last I heard, she was busy explaining tax records to people who carry badges instead of clipboards. 6 months later, Jim and Janet were running a reformed MRCA with open books and boring, honest budgets. Snow went to proper disposal sites instead of corner lawns, and with the attention from Kayla's story, a segment that went viral under the title, "Veteran Turns HOA Abuse into Wall of Snow," Megan and I started the Carter Property Rights Fund, a small nonprofit that helps families facing the same kind of HOA bullying we went through, using paperwork, not plows, to push back. I still think about that morning. Sometimes, the sound of blades on pavement, the look on Veronica's face when she realized she couldn't bluff her way out anymore, and I wonder where the line really is between righteous defense and overkill, because I turned their abuse into a viral spectacle, into arrests and headlines, and a wall people drove past all winter as a warning, and on my best days I tell myself it was exactly what needed to happen to stop them from doing it to someone more vulnerable. But on quieter nights, I catch myself asking the same question I'll leave with you. When people in power treat your families, hardship like a convenient dumping ground, when they lie, cheat, and threaten to protect their comfort, what does real justice look like? How far is too far when you finally fight back? And if you were standing where I stood, with a dozer in the garage, the law on your side, and nothing left to lose, would you have built that wall too?